I'd like to call this House to order. Congratulations to all the teams to making it out to the final round, all 4 of you. We are here to debate the following. This House believes that in instances where peaceful protests are met with disproportionately violent state response, protesters should respond violently. With that, I would like to call the opening government team first speaker to start us off with the debate.
Speaker of the House, members of Parliament, the thesis of the government today is that people should not fear from their government. The government should fear from its people. And that is the hardline principle that we are taking as the government team today. And that is that this House believes that in instances where peaceful protests are met with a disproportionately violent state response, protesters should respond violently. And we are taking the hard line in saying that, violence begets violence. And that we fundamentally believe that violence occurs on 2 levels in the scope of today's debate: physical and emotional. I'll be talking to you about some of the physical violations that occur. My partner Ben is going to be talking to you about some of the more emotional or some of the insidious ways that violence manifests itself in our system today. So, fundamentally, the government believes that escalation is good because it causes a catalyst for change. Not escalating in basically says that you're gonna, bend over and take it. And when you believe in something, you should be willing to stand up and take a little tear gas. That it is something that if you are not fully committed to this, right, what's the point? Your point, sir.
At what point is the violent response to protesters disproportionate as opposed to proportionally violent?
Well, that's ultimately up to the state and really outside of the scope of what I can define for the course of this debate. Anytime that there's a one-upsmanship, more or less, right? Then you would go ahead and say that, if people are out there holding candles, humming or singing a song or something like that, and the state response is come out with nightclubs and start beating people and bashing people's heads in, I think that's a disproportionate response to what's there. So what we believe as the government team today is believing that we ought to respond in kind. That you're asking for it when the government decides to take a nightstick, to start shooting people with rubber bullets, to start shooting people with real bullets, to use a water cannon, or even tear gas, that you have a social and moral obligation to stand up against that abuse of power. The First Amendment is very clear that we have the right to peaceful assembly. The First Amendment is very clear that we have a right to petition our government to redress wrongdoings. And when the government responds in a way that openly inflicts violence, that hits people, that strikes people, that puts them into the emergency room, right, that kills people, you have a moral obligation to do the best thing that you know how to do, which is not necessarily violence, but it's to stand up for what you believe in. There are 3 scenarios that we as the government team believe that it is a fitting way to respond to violence. And the first is for our people who stand in solidarity with those who are at Standing Rock. I believe fundamentally that a snowball is an acceptable way to respond to people that are being tear gassed and maced. Moreover, if you look at the classic 1960s college campus protests, right, picking up a tear gas grenade and throwing it back at the cops is an acceptable way to respond to the violence that doesn't escalate it, right? I'm not suggesting that you bring matches to a gasoline fight. But I am suggesting that that you go ahead and look at things in a way that if you know, you shouldn't be looking for the fight to begin with, but if they're going to bring the fight to us, the government had better be prepared to, the people will not put up with that kind of oppression. Your point, sir.
The First Amendment supports our right to peaceful protest. However, if we're no longer peacefully protesting as we're committing violence, it becomes justified in the state's eyes and in the eyes of the public to repress us in this instance.
Well, in no way it doesn't say that we have to be sheep and only peacefully protest. I mean, we can protest in a variety of different ways. Look at what Anonymous has done in order to protest. Actively hacking or like cyber violence is a way in which you can, which is an appropriate and an acceptable response to government violence. Your point, sir.
And when Anonymous is caught, right, when they catch the people that do this, they put them in jail, right, because they are violating the law. So at the point where they move from peaceful to non-peaceful, it suddenly becomes illegal.
Look, I'm not saying that you have easy decisions to make in addressing this debate today. What I am saying is that if the government is prepared to use violence against you, don't you think that you should be ready to use violence against your government? Especially if you feel convicted that what you believe is the right and true course of action. Your point, sir.
When the Black Panther protest movement took violent action against the state because they could not protect their lives or property, the state feared them and violently erased their protest movement from existence. How do you ensure these protest movements do not get erased?
Look, I can't handle everything on, everything has to be on a case-by-case basis. It didn't work out for the Black Panthers. It has, but ultimately, what we have as a result of that is a more modern way, of looking at Black Lives Matter. The movement still continues. The rage still goes against the machine, but it just is redirected into new avenues. Finally, we believe, as the government team today, that fire hoses, water cannons ought to be met in kind with super soakers at a minimum. Because to be honest with you, ultimately, what we are advocating today is a system in which the government should be concerned with the response of the people. You get to choose whether you want to be a shark or whether you want to be a sheep, but you can't be both. And I believe for the reasons that people are protesting today, that we ought to go ahead and admit that we need to make a stand. That stand starts today. Vote for the government team. We beg to propose.
Thank you to the government. We'll now recognize the first speaker from the opening opposition.
Violence begets violence. We think that this is a very interesting thing for the opening government to bring up because that's exactly the point of the opposition here today. We say that peaceful protest is the best method for achieving the results that these protests desire. We say that when these protests turn violent, that it gives the government justification to take reaction against these protesters, and at the end of the day, ends up not getting them the results. So what we're saying is that when protesters respond to violence with violence, the direct result of that is that they're not as likely to achieve the goals that they want. We think that the value in this round and what this round should be weighed on is which team shows the best solvency, which team has the most likelihood of the protesters getting the results they so desire. And we say, on our side of the house today uniquely, that peaceful protest is the best method to achieve these results. Let's go through some examples. Let's go through some examples of peaceful protest that has worked. In the Ukraine, the government violently cracked down upon protesters trying to remove the current government from power. The protesters continued peacefully even though they were shot, even though they had rocks thrown at them, and they continued peacefully throughout all of this, even as the government escalated. The end result of this was that eventually they ended up in front of the Capitol building and the president resigned and a new government was put in place. Example number 2 is that of Slovakia. Slovakia had a protest of 500,000 people around the end of the Soviet era, which led to the dismantling of its Soviet government and the replacement with a more proper form of government as a result. Third point, India, right? India, the peaceful protest of Gandhi, successfully kicked the British out of the country, right? And although many people died, they did get the result they desired, okay? And examples of times when this doesn't work. Syria, right? Syria has led to a giant bloody civil war that we're in right now. Certain parts of the Arab Spring, especially in Egypt, violence was met by violence by the military from various Middle Eastern states, and it led to, again, the deaths of many people, right? We also have examples of the Black Panthers, which they bring up on this side, which were violently suppressed, and they never got their movement out, right? So this is a lot of examples. We're trying to say that there's definitely examples of where violent protest doesn't work. There's a lot of examples as to where peaceful protest does work. But the real question we should be asking today is why? Why is peaceful protest the most likely to bring us the solvency that we want? We say that this is true for three main reasons. Number one, that violence begets, but also justifies more violence on the part of the state. What we're saying is that even under their levels of appropriate response, where they're throwing snowballs or balls of ice at the police, where they're taking up tear gas and throwing it back, this provides the justification for saying, hey, these guys are violent. They need to be suppressed. And it provides the justification for further violence against these protesters. We've seen this many times, especially in Syria, where a peaceful protest turned violent and the military was called in to violently suppress these things. We see this all across the world. We've seen this in many different revolutions where violent protest is shut down as a result of the government saying, oh, you're violent? Okay, we'll be more violent towards you. At the end of the day, it also allows them to justify human rights abuses, it allows them to classify them as violent, and it allows them to sweep the protesters under the rug, which brings us to our second point. But before we get into that, does the average population, or does the average citizen have the power to take down the government and the military? No, they don't. The military is far more powerful, has far more technology, has far more ability to take down these people, right? The only hope peaceful protesters have of overthrowing a government is by using the attention of the international community and of their own communities in order to successfully overthrow these oppressive governments. Because fighting against the military, sorry, there's drones, there's A-10 warthogs, there's nukes. You can't beat them in a stick versus stick fight, because it's really a stick versus nuke fight. Can't be done. Moving on to our second point, but before I move on, yeah.
Okay, the American Revolution. It took violence, it took standing up against a king, it took watering the tree of liberty with the blood of not just patriots, but also tyrants. I mean, you have to, unless you're willing to lay it on the line, how can you try to win everything?
Well, first of all, right, we're going to say that it's actually a lot more successful that way. But on your point of the American Revolution, we say that this isn't applicable to today's current scenario. At the time, people within these revolutionary militias had access to the same kind of weaponry and technology that the English government had. They don't have access to that in today's status quo. Sure, we have guns, we don't have nukes, we don't have predators, we don't have any of these other things. Anyways, second point, that violence from protesters directly leads to the loss of the message they're trying to achieve. And it leads to the government strawmanning them into a group of violent thugs rather than allowing their message to be heard. An example of this is, number one, the idea of the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter is a super important movement that brings up a really important issue in our society, which is the fact that police disproportionately kill young African American males. When Black Lives Matter got violent, their message wasn't broadcast as much throughout the media. Rather, the media focused on the fact that they were violent, and government will focus on that as well. When people are peaceful and being disproportionately killed, it brings attention to their message, and people wonder, why are the peaceful protesters out there? When protesters become violent, government has the ability to stigmatize and strawman them into violent, oppressive groups, just like in Syria, where peaceful protesters were now labeled as rebels and violently suppressed. It allows for the dehumanization of these people, the loss of their message, the muddying of their message, and at the end of the day, loss of support, which brings us to our third and final point, not at this time. Peaceful protests are the most likely to succeed and bring the most solvency because they draw more sympathy from the international community, from the local community, and the fact that people working within the government, military and police, are less inclined to shoot innocent people. They're less inclined to suppress these protests violently if they remain peaceful and they do not have a justified reason to continue their violence. What are we saying here? We're saying that when protesters peacefully protest and are violently suppressed, it draws the attention of international human rights groups, it draws the attention of the UN, it draws the attention of all these various international communities and brings the spotlight for that particular area, and most importantly, on the message that these people have. With the support of the international community, they are far more likely to succeed in achieving what they want as opposed to violently protesting and being labeled as that. Furthermore, the local community also can stand in solidarity with these people because they see the government as the aggressor rather than the people as the aggressor. We say, not this time and out of order, that the local community sympathizes more and is more likely to get behind a type of protest that is not violent because they feel as if the government is the aggressor and they can rise up against that perceived injustice. We believe that this creates far greater solvency because of the amount of people that would also join in these revolutions. Finally, again, police are less inclined to shoot innocent people. We say that less people would die in these types of protests and revolutions as opposed to a violent protest, and violence only begets violence. Thank you.
Right, thank you. We'll now go back to the opening government team for the second speaker.
Thank you everyone for being here. It's good to see you all and it's good to be in this round. Now, it's funny, the UN peacekeepers, they're a very, very well-armed group of individuals. And in fact, you'd think that that strong military prowess would be their most powerful asset. However, the most powerful asset of UN peacekeepers is to be human shields, is to be bodies in the wake. Because this causes emotional backlash, political backlash. The violence leads to more emotional violence, and it acts as a catalyst in fighting oppression or, in many cases, violent repression of regimes and or protests. Now, I'd like to get into a few points of rebuttal. Now, going on to the opposition's case, so they say first and foremost that whoever solves that should win, that violence justifies violence, that this doesn't work. Well, first and foremost, the vast majority of revolutions throughout the history of the world have only been achieved through violence. However, besides that, they make some points about how the average citizen, do they have the power to take out the government? Of course not, duh. Like, obviously not. That is why we advocate for returning in kind. Things like, for instance, throwing the snowballs back, super soakers, or throwing the tear gas grenades back. Now, these are all forms of violence. Now, recall the government's thesis, not now, that it is the government that should fear its people, not the people who should fear its government. And that is very essential in this round today, because from a philosophical standpoint, we cannot stand for a government that's willing to oppress its people violently when they simply want to peacefully protest. Now, on some points of rebuttal, my opponent mentioned, 3 instances of peaceful protests that worked. Ukraine, Slovakia, and India. Here's 3 instances of peaceful protests that didn't work. Tiananmen Square led to the death of hundreds. They protested peacefully, not successful. The Green Revolution in Iran, they protested peacefully, they were violently repressed. And finally, what's most close to home, another instance of peaceful protest that simply is not working and seems to be failing is that of the Standing Rock oil pipeline and the issues that are surrounding that today. I'll take your question, sir.
Okay, just to be clear, you guys said you're going to take the hard line. Does that mean when the government shoots protesters, the protesters have the right to shoot back in force?
Well, in that instance, of course, because the government should, in fact, not be doing that in the first place. And when you look to revolutionary ideas, it's important to have that ability in the first place, to be able to return in kind. Look to what the founding fathers of our Constitution stated when they said that the government should fear its people, that we should be willing to take up arms in order to respond to a violent and tyrannical government, and that, we believe, should be carried through in this round today. Now, here is 3 examples where violence, or responding with violence, actually did work. So, the revolution of Haiti, the independence of Tunisia from France, and Algeria, that's what I meant. And finally, the independence of Brazil. All of these were instances where violence was in fact necessary and in fact successful. Now, moving down, they talk about the peaceful protest is the most likely to succeed. Use the analysis that I gave about how, in fact, there have been just as many examples of how peaceful protest has failed, and where we see that repressive governments are not willing. In fact, they're like, yeah, please protest peacefully so we can simply repress you at a much easier level. That is what tends to happen. Now, so I've gone through their points. My partner brought up some good points. He talked about college campuses throwing back tear gas, fire hoses, and potentially responding with water cannons. Now, these are all symbolic gestures of violence. Now, what's so important about the symbolic gestures is that, again, when it's responded with brutality, when it's responded to with brutal force, we see that, in fact, many of the sympathies of bypassers, of people witnessing this, will in fact act. It acts as a catalytic event, which takes me to my first piece of positive matter, not now. Now, emotional violence. Why is this so important? Well, the first point underneath this is that escalation is good. Let's parametricize this example down to the Standing Rock situation. So, escalation is good. As we've seen, when things escalate, more attention is brought to the problem, especially in democracies with free press like we have today. However, even though we have the First Amendment right to peacefully assemble, to peacefully protest, we are not being given this right. The government is oppressing us by simply responding with violence. To the people who congregate and peacefully protest, they're being responded to with water hoses in freezing weather, tear gas grenades, rubber bullets, violence that, quite frankly, says, you know what, First Amendment's not that important because we're the police. And now that takes me to the next point, is that North Dakota is a very far off place, and that is why, in particular, there needs to be some sort of catalyst which escalation can be. Now, police brutality, it's one of the hottest topics. I mean, it was brought up with the BLM movement. We're going to bring it up on our side. This is something that needs to be addressed, and that is exactly why we need a catalyst, an event that can really bring more attention. And we believe, as the government, that bringing more attention to Standing Rock, to these individuals who are peacefully protesting, can be a potential tipping point for many of the issues that we have in the United States. Now, if you look to the Standing Rock situation, currently I believe there are there are law enforcement agencies from 16 different states who are involved in repressing the peaceful protesters. Protected time, but I'll take it.
Thank you. Okay, so when you give us the three examples of how violence worked, you talk about Haiti, Algeria, and Brazil. It's not enough to just name a country. Tell us how the violence actually overcame the overwhelming violence on the part of the state.
Absolutely it is. They were being responded to in violence. In fact, in Algeria in particular, hundreds of thousands of innocents were simply being killed because the French wanted to hold on to their stake of that country. The Algerians wanted independence, and for that they fought, and eventually they won. Now, going back to the idea of Standing Rock and kind of bringing this down to our own constitution, we are protected under the First Amendment to peacefully assemble. When our government says, forget that, when our government responds in violence to peaceful protest, we absolutely need to take our founding fathers' words into account, and we need to rise up, and we need to show our government who is exactly the boss, and we as the government believe that it is the people, not the police. Thank you.
I'll now recognize the last speaker from the opening opposition team.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is easy. It is so easy to fall to the same base and carnal impulses that justify a government watchman or a soldier or a policeman to take a gun into their own hands and to end the life of a human being. It is easy to fall into that carnal desire to commit violence for no reason. And that's why it's easy for them to run a case that justifies violence in response to violence, yet in response to more violence. But it is hard. It is disciplined. But furthermore, it is best to resist those desires and propose a form of protest that goes above the same evil morality that binds government to the idea that killing people is somehow okay. We're going to repeat what Stephen said in this debate, which affirms ultimately the message that peaceful protest and no other kind of protest is the best form of resisting any kind of state, benign or malevolent. First of all, Stephen made it very clear, and they affirmed, so we assume that they concede, that violence does indeed beget violence. If the state acts violently and the protesters respond, clearly the state has a predisposition to respond disproportionately, meaning the government will act in even more violence. And that will cause protesters to act even more violently, so you have a positive feedback of more and more violence culminating in what Stephen said was essentially civil war. He talked about the Arab Spring. It was a peaceful protest. When the police started attacking them and they responded, it spiraled into this like tit-for-tat kind of deal where ultimately an entire region fell to its knees because we couldn't resist the urge to fight back. If that didn't happen, if we responded peacefully, that world would have never existed. Millions of people would be alive and more well off than they are today. Furthermore, and that's a theoretical argument, by the way, we want to note, like in theory it is true that violence begets violence. They argue primarily by example, we argue by syllogism and conjecture, and that's the overarching theme of why so far this side of the House has claimed the debate today. No, thank you, gentlemen. Second of all, we point to you that violence is indeed a loss of message. And what better example to talk about than Black Lives Matter? If Black Lives Matter began to act violently, I can guarantee you immediately, the media would label them as thugs, as they always have for the past 2 centuries. They will label them as criminals, and at that point the message of wanting racial equality will go away, because at the point at which they start violently acting against the state, it actually justifies the state to commit even further wrongdoing onto them. So not only does their message get lost in the chaos, not only do they get branded as criminals, but more importantly, it becomes so much easier to justify even worse responses. Specifically, they get rebranded as terrorists, and we think there's a special meaning to being rebranded a terrorist, because no one tries to understand terrorists. In the international community, the media, as soon as it implicates someone as a terrorist, everyone dismisses their needs. The everyman says, who cares why they're upset? They're terrorists. And that's what happens when people engage in violence. I yield.
So, have you seen the movie V for Vendetta? I mean, laying it on the line is all that you can really do at the end of the day. It's either you are 100% committed to the cause, or you're not committed to the cause at all.
Madam Speaker, if they assert their case with edgy films from 10 years ago and laying it on the line, meaning using a super soaker, indeed a very weak government case before us. But finally, sympathy. When we do not respond in kind, we garner a certain kind of sympathy from the international community, as the monks did in the Vietnam War when they lit themselves on fire. But specifically, that sympathy is important because when you don't engage the violence, the moral calculus is clear on who the villain is. When you don't respond to violence and the state does, the state is the villain, and the international community, by precedent, forces it to back down as it did. But more importantly, on the local level, genetically, we have a predisposition for feeling really guilty for killing innocent human beings. Most people cannot look someone in the face and shoot them when they are not a threat, and we think on principle that solves the issues that caused the protest in the first place after this point. The new argument is that even if our safety is threatened, protests happen because of a human rights abuse. If we truly care about human rights, then we should affirm them by not taking them away from others. We should affirm the idea of nonviolence by ergo not engaging in it. I'll take one.
So you say that people have this natural disposition to not want to harm innocent people, yet you can look to countless examples throughout history, like the genocide in Europe of the Jewish people, that many Germans who may have otherwise just been decent people before were coerced by their government to kill millions of innocent people.
Here's the thing. There is enough brainwashing by a violent state to justify that, but at the bottom line, most Nazi soldiers did feel remorse. In fact, there's a very interesting, not anecdote, but photographic evidence of Nazi soldiers being shown what happened to the Jews in Auschwitz, like video and photographic evidence. Every single one of those men broke down crying because there is something inside us that sanctions that violence. Now, I want to get to a little bit of rebuttal on this side of the House, and they said that all successful revolutions are violent. One, the thing in India, no coverage of that. But two, that's a logical fallacy. Just because all those revolutions were violent is not a proof that they could not have succeeded non-violently. We think that's kind of a wash argument. They give us 3 examples, Haiti, Algeria, Brazil, and then they proceed to never talk about them again. And then finally, they say escalation is good, and they contextualize that within the premise of Standing Rock. That is literally the worst thing that the Native Americans could do right now in a country where for 200 years they were branded as violent savages and justified literally taking all of their land. That perspective that marginalized an entire country into oppression, we think when they escalate, all that does is give this government, give government this old mentality of, look, the savages are acting up, so when they escalate, once again, their message gets washed away, as we said, so we clash with them on pretty much every point they bring up. The message goes away, number one. Number two, they are branded as thugs and it's easier to justify violence. And number three, in the chaos of war and violence, nothing ever actually is achieved. So in the brief time I have, I'm going to explain what is the difference. They say war solves for war. We say peace solves for war. They argue by specific examples like Standing Rock and Haiti, which they never bring up. We argue in theory, by premise, by conclusion, that being nonviolent affirms the rights you stand for, garners support from the international community, overall makes the message clear and removes the moral ambiguity from determining who is right and who is wrong. At the end of the day, when we are given a bat, what we must do is extend a handshake or a hug. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now move on to the second half. Opening us will be the second government side. First speaker.
So what's the question today? The question is self-defense or appeasement. It's not, and the question is not, do we live on our feet, or pardon me, do we die on our feet or do we live on our knees? The question is, do we die on our feet or do we die on our knees? Because in this entire debate, they have not really given a clear, concise reason as to why peaceful protest is so much better. Sure, they've criticized the crap out of, pardon me, all of the terrible, horrible things that happens in certain instances, of some instances, and where people have defended themselves against tyrannical and oppressive governments. What they really have not done is shown us why it's so horrible to say, no, you cannot kill me. I am going to defend myself. And what I'm going to do, as our predecessors did somewhat, is really show some instances of when people stood up for themselves and actually elicited positive change, and how their whole philosophical argument about, oh, you can't, change things with violence is fundamentally wrong. So first and foremost, I'm going to start getting my refutations here, which is, let's see, the Black Panthers were violently wiped out. Well, that's actually not 100% true. The Black Panthers disbanded in 1975 after getting most of their goals finished. One of their big things they did was community patrols, in which they armed themselves and followed police officers around to ensure that these people were not killing people. And this was hugely successful. They did not even have to be completely violent. They just had to show their presence with firearms and be prepared to defend individual rights, which these gentlemen aren't. Now, they also said that a peaceful protest is the best method. Well, the peaceful protest is the best method when that is an option. But when you are being gunned down, when your government is shooting you in the streets, or tear gassing you, or pepper spraying you, or what have you, you do not have the option any longer of peaceful protest. Standing there is an act of insanity. Continuing to allow yourself to be harmed is mentally ill. And I can say that because I myself know a thing or two about standing there and taking it, and I'm not willing to do that or allow these gentlemen to do so in this conversation. So moving on to some more of our refutation. Our friend here brings up the violent protests in Syria, which were repressed by some gentlemen who, were violent. Yeah, they were very violent. But what he fails to realize is that these violent protests had been preceded by a long history of peaceful protests. And all of this UN foreign aid and all this outcry from the West did what? It did nothing. They were still being violent. Yes, sir?
I find it offensive that they choose to obscure the history of the Black Panthers. The reason the Black Panthers went out of existence is because the FBI exterminated their leaders and jailed their leaders, not because they succeeded.
Except that every single, like 8 out of 10 of their major key points had been successful, and they disbanded after having, there were other leaders who could have moved on in and taken the position. Yes, some people were repressed by the government that you gentlemen are defending, but many of them were still there to continue the fight. And they decided to continue and break down after being successful. Now, he also says, you can't beat the government because of American military supremacy. Can we honestly stand here and say that we can think of no instance in contemporary history in which the United States military has lost its will to continue to fight because of, shall I say, not well-trained individuals with small arms? I can think of ISIS, not ISIS, pardon me, I can think of Al-Qaeda, I can think of the Taliban, I can think of instances in the American contemporary, like the United States, Vietnam. There are numbers of times where people have stood up against our government and won with nothing but small arms and what we have available to us today. He also says that violence makes the movements a strongman, and he brings up Black Lives Matter. But what he fails to, he himself acknowledged that Black Lives Matter came about because the government was disproportionately killing black individuals, innocent black men. So these people have been killed and continuously oppressed, and now they're supposed to continue to take it. And I find that morally reprehensible. Yes, sir, before I go to my
Okay, so you talked about the Vietnam War. There was violent protests, but there were also non-violent protests by college students, by Buddhist monks. At that point, we think this argument is kind of a wash. What is the theoretical principle for justifying a violent response?
Well, I'm so glad you came into that, because I'm about to move into those with my positive matter. But before that, I'm going to really finish off my negatives, which are, this is a positive feedback loop of violence, well, running up and allowing yourself, as opposed to what? You get a positive feedback loop of violence, I kill a cop, or, cop kills an individual, blah, 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 as opposed to what? Standing there and taking it. This is self-defense. You want a theoretical, philosophical defense of our position? Self-defense and human rights. I will not be taking any more questions right now. Self-defense, human rights. You said it's a human rights violation to defend yourself against an oppressive government. My friend, you don't understand what human rights are. Human rights are something that you can do without violating another human's rights. If you shoot me, that's a violation of my human rights, and defending myself against you is not a violation of yours. So very quickly, because I am running out of time, moving into my own positive matter here, there's really no alternative. If you are being attacked, if you are on the street, it's all very good with self. Theoretically, we can do it, and we can speak from our ivory towers here, but if you are on the streets, being attacked by police officers, National Guardsmen, military men, whatever, your options are to run and to scatter and maybe even still get shot, or to make a stand. And this is what I was saying with die on your knees or die on your feet. Because you have an option of dying. Pretty much. Governments are way more powerful, but it takes a lot of resistance and a lot of organization to defend them, and it has happened. But in that moment, there's no way you're really winning this. You can get away, sure, but your movement's broken. It has scattered and it is gone. Now, moving on to my next point, it can elicit change. The Pittsburgh PD in the 1980s, and this is the most 1980s thing I can possibly say, bombed a black Rastafarian group that was defending itself in a pillbox on a black tenement. And what they did was they took their guns and they shot at the police officers who were hovering with helicopters with breaching charges, bombing them. And what they did was scared off these people. This was an immediate instance where they're like, no, I don't want to die, I'm getting out of here. And so they flew on off and they stopped bombing civilians with hand grenades. So there's some very positive change here. The Battle of Atlas, Tennessee. There was a group of Vietnam veterans who came back to Tennessee, and they defended themselves against a authoritarian sheriff who was, defiling the sovereignty of these people by vote rigging and doing all these things. They defended themselves, and after their protest, they were shot at. So they rounded up some firearms, and they went down to the sheriff's hall, and they made him resign. He called in the National Guard, but the National Guard got there only to realize he was the bad guy, arrested him, and sent him off. So again, we're seeing that violence and defending yourself can elicit some serious positive change, while still being on par with the principles of self-defense and natural rights. So finally, my last point is you can truly unify movements. Egypt, Syria, and the Northern Alliance and Taliban have all been movements repressed, their peace movements and the freedom movements have all been repressed by governments. And when they were shot at and when they were cracked down upon, this really brought these movements together. They saw, oh my God, we cannot be moderate anymore, we cannot be peaceful, we must defend ourselves. And it's for these reasons and the reasons I have gone in, as with my refutations, that you must say that closing government today has won the day.
On to the closing government. Closing opposition.
We think it's extremely problematic that on both sides of the government team, the narrative is essentially that people like Mahatma Gandhi, their philosophy boils down to essentially die on your knees rather than stand or die for your values. They make this a question of honor in some sort of like masculine way of like, you need to fight and stand up for yourself. But this is not about like just saying what is honorable or what appears to make you strong. It's about saying what actually accomplishes your objective. What creates a society that benefits from this? And how do you ultimately get your message out and create a peaceful society, which is your goal if you are using peaceful protest in the first place? I intend to go through a few points of rebuttal, 4 specifically, and then provide 2 constructive extensions for the closing opposition today. So the first is like if you look at opening government, they give you all of these examples, and almost every example they give you, when they're actually asked, are violent revolutions. And they say that these are examples of protests being effective. But I think this is very problematic because, first off, when you're doing a peaceful protest, it isn't usually like the Dakota Access Pipeline protesters don't say, we want the government to be changed. They say we want a policy, a specific policy change or something like that. You cannot have a literal violent overthrow of the government every time you have one issue that you need to be redressed. This is why petitions, protest is very different from an actual entire country, in Vietnam, for example, going to war with the country. So this is extremely important that we make this differentiation, because we need to be able to actually change these specific issues, and if every time we try to do that, we have to resort to violence, it creates a massive problematic precedent for the future. Second point of rebuttal. There's this eye for an eye kind of ideal of okay, violence begets violence, and this is true, violence begets violence, but it's also, this is the philosophy that people use to justify so much horrible stuff. If you look at almost any terrorist group out there, how do they justify what they do? They say, well, the United States came in and they bombed our people, they killed our people, and we are the only force fighting against them. I'm not saying that these people are terrorists by any means, but I'm saying that if you take that philosophy that far, it will always justify horrible circumstances that will destroy your society and not give you any success in the long run. So we say that when this is literally the philosophy of terrorists, whereas you have one side, we have the philosophy of Gandhi, you can look to how one was successful and one was moral. That is an extremely important issue. They say the Black Panthers are successful, disbanded just because they were okay, we're not necessarily, absolutely, my partner will elaborate on that, but no, they freaking were being exterminated, they're being killed. That is not the same as being if you're being killed, your goals are not successful. Yes?
We agree that if you're being killed, your goals are not successful. And on the point that both government or opposition parties have made about violence begetting violence, I'm a protester, I'm getting beating, I'm going to get beaten to death. The violence continues, but at one point, am I supposed to stand up and save my own life?
Okay, this is actually in reference to the fourth point of rebuttal, so I'll get to that in a moment. But I will flag that as we get to it. And the third point of rebuttal is once again, there's this difference between guerrilla warfare and protests, right? In their whole example of saying, there's all these people who can fight back against the government and all that, that's not what we want. We don't want the Dakota Access Pipeline people to have to fight and get to go to war and ultimately cause death to massive amounts of people to do that. And it's not going to be the same thing. They can't do that if you're a small fringe movement, right? The only way that kind of thing works is if you have support of a great variety of people. Many of these protests start small, and then they build support. If you start small and then you go violent, you will never build support, which I will be elaborating on in one of my constructive arguments. But on the fourth point of rebuttal, which is reference to specifically your POI, this idea that it's self-defense. The thing is that this is actually not like self-defense. This is someone hits you, and then you get up and go and kill them. You go up and you attack them. This is not the same. This is saying after the fact has happened, we are going to unleash violent backlash. This is retribution. This is vengeance. That is not why we have self-defense laws. Self-defense laws is if someone is in the actual process. This is not if the police are shooting at you with rubber bullets and then you pull out a gun and try to shoot them, that's not self-defense. That is suicide. So let's not make that comparison. This is clearly not self-defense. This is about saying, yes, maybe people are justified in fighting, but this is not going to be productive for them, and it's only going to endanger them further. It's not self-defense. Moving into my arguments, I think the one really important clarification, and how we kind of differentiate from the front half on this, is that we agree with our opening half, but we also said that we need to look at the ultimate effects on society and not just the protests. And I think one way is that you look at this is through the difference between persuasion and coercion. Because persuasion is how we ultimately change people's minds. We change people's minds by, for example, when you have the Dakota Access Pipeline. I think it's the greatest example for the opposition today. Because what's actually been happening is it started off as a small movement of people protesting. And as the police moved in, as we saw more violence, more rubber bullets against the protesters, more people started showing up. More people started saying, hey, we stand in solidarity. Because when you're indifferent and you see this video clip of someone being shot, you go, what the heck is going on? If you see a video clip of two people shooting each other, you may divest entirely. So what this ultimately did is it creates an amount of persuasion where people are drawn to your cause. When you get that, you have what's happening right now. Representative Tulsi Gabbard literally flew in to go visit there. We have veterans who are moving there to stand with Standing Rock. We have people all over the country joining in. You have media and journalists that can actually go there. When you create a war zone, media can't even get involved. No, you're not going to have representatives coming. You're not going to have people joining. You're going to completely cut that off. Yes.
On that point, being dead is a really good way to not be able to get your message across. He keeps talking about how people aren't going to even listen to you if you're being violent, but people are also not going to be listen to you if you have been maimed or murdered.
Yes, if you have attacked the police, they will kill you. You can have that if you want. If you attack the police, you will die and you will be dead and you will not get your message across. So
This is like ultimately you're going to lose access to these main recruitment channels. This is why like coercion is ultimately a backsliding force. Because you can create change, but if you haven't changed, you can create change in like policy or in governments, you can overthrow things. But if you haven't ultimately changed people's minds, then people have no reason to stay with you. They have no reason to actually agree with you, right? Like if you force something through, other people will have backlash against it. So a second argument that I really want to get to here is the moral precedent of the sense, which is that we say that violence is never appropriate. And we say that when you actually start using it, what it does is it desensitizes our society to seeing more violence. Every time there's a protest and the police escalate and the other people escalate, you see more arming, more heavily arming of our police departments. You see a more violent society. You see an escalation towards this, which actually is detrimental to the values of a civil society. We no longer have people wanting to go out and protest because they're afraid that a police officer will come heavily armed, ready to kill them. We say that in a society where you focus on peaceful protest, you actually de-escalate to the greatest extent possible. When you escalate it further, it creates a very big problem. Like this, an example of like Rodney King, for example. When those riots began, it created a massive amount of backlash from the conservative community. They started arming themselves. They do not trust. They have an ingrained fear now of like Black Americans that was accelerated by that. This is why we're proud to oppose.
Now we'll recognize the last speaker on the government side. Ready?
Yes, ma'am. Getting my timer set. There's been a lot of talk about coercion versus persuasion by the previous speaker. I'd like to first touch upon what coercion by persuasion means, and vice versa, persuasion by coercion. Now, Max Weber, who, I think he knows a few things or two about sociology in today's world, defines the state's monopoly on legitimate force as coercion. They have the only sense to do this. Now, if we look at how they apply this towards this environment, they are illegitimately using that force, that monopoly that they have going on. So, ergo, if you have the illegitimate use of force which has been granted for the protection of the people, it is the right of the people to defend themselves in that regard. Now, I'd like to sum up and distill what this debate really is about. It is all about what should you do when the state uses its monopoly on illegitimate force on you. Should you do nothing? Or should you do something? Now, in a POI, I brought up a hypothetical point of view wherein you are a peaceful protester, going about your due diligence, bringing no harm to anyone, singing a song, and all of a sudden you are begat upon by unsolicited violence. Now, this violence will not stop unless the person who is the aggressor chooses to do so. So how do you make this person who is acting against your own physical well-being, your own self-preservation instincts, how do you get them to stop? We do not believe that the most effective method to do this is to cower in a ball and say, please, sir, do not hit me. I am violent protesting. I'm non-violently protesting. We believe that the right thing to do is to respond in a measure of self-defense. Now, as I'll reinforce in my positive matter later, this measure of self-defense actually embodies the resistance movement. And it's funny that opening parties brought up the aspect of amplifying your problem to other states, to get UN aid. How are they going to know what is going on if you just sit there and you take it? How are they going to know that you're in duress if no one is standing up saying we have a problem, especially when those people who are peacefully protesting are trying to do so and are being beaten down with an unsolicited violent response? I will take your question.
Right, so here's the thing. When people are being violently beaten down with an unsolicited violent response, guess who pays attention? The international community, the local community, they get the change they want. In your case, fine, you kill one police officer, but nothing ever changes.
I've never said anything about killing a police officer. I've said about invoking reciprocal violence as a measure of self-defense. And in that model, if I am killed by the police officer, I can't even kill them back. I mean, the reciprocity, it's impossible. So, moving on to another matter of rebuttal from the previous speaker. They say that we're trying to dress it up. This is about honor. It's about, and to a certain extent, yes, that's there. But more than anything, it is about survival. And the best method of survival to prevent yourself from dying. Because as you say in the beginning, you risk being a straw man. You can't be a straw man if you're dead. Yes?
If it was about survival, people wouldn't go out and protest in the first place. It's about making a legitimate change. And the only way we can do that is if people are on your side, which you get by having the moral high ground, rather than by engaging in the same tactics that people are opposed to.
Yeah, I really like that. I wish that we lived in the world where that was the solution. I wish that we lived in a world where we could say, you know what, this is not fair, we have a problem, everybody pay attention, and all of a sudden everyone would come rushing to their aids. But unfortunately, as we've seen, this doesn't work this way, and proof of this is the fact that these people have gathered in peaceful assembly and are being coercively used force upon by illegitimate means for the purpose of suppressing the message that these protesters have. If it wasn't about suppression, why else would they do it? Now, moving on to our own positive matter, which was substantial, my partner Benjamin brought up two very specific examples in America, the Rastafarians in Pittsburgh and also Atlas, Tennessee, and how they negated and mitigated the violent ends that were brought upon them unjustly with violence, and it worked out for everybody. Now, when opposing, the previous speaker says that, the violent overthrow of the government is the inevitable goal. Well, I have to ask, did the Rastafarians of Pittsburgh attempt to do that after they saved themselves? Did the people of Atlas, Tennessee do that? I think we know the answer, and it's an obvious no. So, ergo, that we've seen two examples in this country in the last 25 years, 25 to 30 years, we can say that yes, nonviolent protests are effective, but also the violence reciprocally in a protest do not lead to the harms, the so-called harms, that the previous speaker mentioned to. Now, another point which my partner reinforced was what happened with the Black Panther Party. You know what? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say my partner's absolutely right. They were able to get most of the reforms they were looking for. Yes, some of them went to jail. Yes, some of them were shot by the FBI. But the Black Panthers actually stood up for what they believed in, and they did something very, very smart. They created a buffer. Because this policy doesn't mean that peaceful protest should end. It means that peaceful protest should continue. And the diversification of the types of protest is often what's necessary to drive the negotiative option towards the middle. We look at Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and I think it is very distinguishable, yes please, that Martin Luther King benefited from radical rhetoric from Malcolm X. It allowed him to occupy the middle ground. A middle ground he would not have been able to occupy if not for a different voice on his side. A different voice that spoke the same message. A different voice that had the same underlying shared grievance behind it. And it's these voices that are in concert, amplified, that are the signal to foreign powers such as the UN, to foreign countries that have similar ideologies, that might have some sort of emotional response. But that emotional response does not happen when we see people who are unwilling to help themselves. We see an unwinnable situation. We see an area where the people have given up. Now, it's hard for me to say this, and the next step in this process of just rolling over tends to be genocide. Has been, will be, because it's easy. Because they're already rolled over for you. We can look at Nazi Germany. We can look at the numerous situations in Africa. But when a diversion ideology that has protested peacefully continues to submit itself, does not broadcast to the international community, does not stand up for themselves, they continue to be slammed into the ground. And that violence begats the worst kind of violence.
Time. All right, I'll organize the last speaker of the debate from the second opposition team. You have the floor.
The government bench was a lot like the movie 300. They gave a riveting speech about why we should resist oppression at all costs, and then everybody dies. We don't think that they've done enough to tell us why, on their side of the house, these protest movements continue. What I want to do in my speech is give 3 points of rebuttal to what we heard from them before crystallizing this debate in 3 central inquiries. First, what is the best mechanism for change? Second is on the principle of self-defense, and is it really self-defense if you are committing yourself to suicide? And then thirdly, how minds are changed in the status quo to actually produce this change. Okay, so first, on rebuttal. The first point of rebuttal that I want to give essentially to their entire side is sort of this example debate that we've been having. We provide examples, they provide examples. We think that they haven't done enough to explain their examples. When they name countries like Brazil and Algeria, they don't tell us like what that actually looked like and what that interaction with the state monopoly of violence looked like. They just name the country. What Sam tells you uniquely on the back half, my partner is Sam, he's right there, is that what they are describing are revolutions and not protest movements. Why? The distinction that Sam tells us is that a revolution looks to overthrow the government, whereas a protest is focused on a more singular issue or multiple issues. We think they don't do enough on their side of the house to link these revolutionary movements to protest movements. Okay, the second point of rebuttal that I want to make is on the Black Panther debate that we've been having. Now, you may have noticed my POIs, and I legit was offended when they tell us that the Black Panthers achieved their goals, and that's why they disbanded. So, first of all, like, this just isn't true. If you look at the history, J. Edgar Hoover literally called the Black Panthers public enemy #1. Coming from UCLA, I've read our history. Literally 2 leaders of the LA chapter of the Black Panther movement were assassinated in Royce Hall by the FBI. We don't think that their movement succeeded. They tell us also that they achieved 8 of their 10 goals. They don't tell us what any of those were, right? We tell you that what they were fighting for was an end to like the incarcerative system of the state, an end to police violence against black bodies. None of those things have ended. We don't think Black Panthers succeeded. Rather, their mechanism ultimately doomed them to suicide because the state exterminated them from existence. Okay. Third rebuttal I want to make is they brought up this new point in the whip speech about how like they also endorse like peaceful protests at the same time as violent protests. So first we say that this is new in the whip, but I'll still respond to it. And so they give us this example of like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, that the reason MLK was able to succeed is because the rabble-rousing, as they put it, of Malcolm X. What happened is the MLK and the peaceful civil rights movement did not succeed because of Malcolm X, but rather despite the violence proposed by Malcolm X. That was a tough hurdle for people to get over, but ultimately the non-violence of MLK and the pictures of like police with dogs on leashes biting non-violent protesters was what turned the tide. And that's where Sam tells you that why persuasion is super important. Okay, let's get to the points of crystallization here. Okay, what is the best mechanism for change? They say violence, we say, or maybe like super soakers and snowballs, I'm not exactly sure, but I think we can say they say violence, we say peaceful protest, right? So the reason that peaceful protest ultimately is better, right, is because you don't run the risk of your message being exterminated. And we talked about that with the Black Panthers. The reason that Malcolm X is no longer alive and his message, which was a nuanced critique of U.S. electoral politics, why even if you give black people the right to vote, it still will not change power structures. That no longer continues, right? Because he gets exterminated from existence because the state labels him as an enemy of the state. This is why, MLK was more successful than Malcolm X because he advocated for peaceful protest rather than any sort of violence that they say on their side of the house brings change. I'll take from it.
So you try to bring up this example saying that it's because of Malcolm X's violence that the state violently repressed him. Well, first and foremost, it wasn't the state that killed Malcolm X. It was actually a member of the Muslim Brotherhood.
So I appreciate your attempt at rebuttal. It was not the Muslim Brotherhood, but it was rather the Nation of Islam that assassinated Malcolm X. The reason that they did that is because as the Nation of Islam became more integrated in the apparatus of the state, they said we can't be so oppositional, and at the point where we have to appeal to the state, Malcolm X is now a figure that is so polarizing and so violent, we have to take him out. The Nation of Islam essentially was an extension of the violence of the state in this case. Okay, so second point of crystallization is how our minds change. And this is what Sam brought to you in our extension in back half. So essentially Sam says that it's about persuasion, right? And in order to persuade the people, you have to make sure that they're able to get access to where these protests are happening. So Sam says that that the media and literally representatives from the state, like Tulsi Gabbard, cannot actually access mix in with these protest movements if it is a war zone going on, right? If it is a peaceful protest, and someone like Tulsi Gabbard then goes and supports the Standing Rock protest movement, what happens is this literally is the state is not willing to attack the state in this sense, right? That the way for them to stop violence happening against the protesters is for someone like Tulsi Gabbard to be there, right? They will not attack protesters if Tulsi Gabbard is one of them. At the point where we say if she's not able to gain access to that because it is such a violent war zone, that's where ultimately the state is going to commit massive violence because there's nothing to stop them from doing that. We think that I thought that was a really good extension by Sam. Third point of crystallization in this debate, the principle of self-defense. And this came out of back half, and we're happy to clash with this, okay? So what we say is that self-defense is not self-defense if you are guaranteed to die as a result. So Sam also tells you that this is people literally committing suicide at the point where they take on a violence apparatus that is much stronger than anything that they can possibly provide, right? They're literally condemning themselves to suicide. And we've provided a lot of examples of this. Further, what we would say is where the principle of self-defense is justified in certain cases is if you are guaranteed to die regardless of whether you commit violence or not, right? So Jews in Nazi ghettos, when the SS was going through just systematically murdering them, we say even though they know they are going to die anyway, that is justified self-defense even though they're going to die anyway. The point where protesters, they decide not to use violence, are not going to die anyway, we think that that's better. Look, we don't think they can just say that violence is a good idea when those movements were exterminated by the state. We urge a vote for the opposition and for peaceful means of change.